50,000 men in a town nobody planned to fight in 3 days. The Civil War had been grinding for 2 years. By the summer of 1863, the Union hadn't broken the South hadn't broken the Union. And Robert E. Lee, the general the Confederacy had built their hopes around, decided the only way to end it was to take the fight north. Not raid, not resupply, to win. On Union soil, in front of the whole world. He almost did it. What stopped him and what it cost both sides to stop him is one of the most brutal, consequential stories in American history. I am Benito, and this is the Jacked Historian. Before we get to Gettysburg, you need to know what these men were fighting about. The United States in 1860 was a country pulling itself apart. The Southern economy ran on cotton, tobacco, and rice. Cotton alone was America's most valuable export. And the system that produced it couldn't function without enslaved labor at a massive scale. By 1860, roughly 4 million people were held in bondage across the South, and the plantation owners who profited from their labor had no intention of giving that up. When Southerners talked about states' rights and their way of life, that's what they were actually defending. Not some abstract political principle, but an economic order. And those two things aren't contradictory. Slavery was both a moral atrocity and the engine their entire economy ran on. That's what the South was fighting to preserve. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in November 1860, Southern states read it as a direct threat to that system, specifically to slavery's expansion into new territories, which would have slowly strangled their economic and political power. The election result was enough. Within months, 11 states had seceded and formed the Confederate States of America. But secession still left one problem. Union military posts still sat on Confederate soil. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on one of them, a garrison at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. That shot started the war. After 2 years of fighting, hundreds of thousands of men were already dead, and neither side had broken the other. The Confederacy was still standing, the Union was still fighting. Then a Confederate army crossed into Pennsylvania. Robert E. Lee had beaten the Union Army so many times that some people in the North were beginning to wonder if they could ever beat him. And Lee knew it. He was pushing that doubt, stretching it, and betting that one decisive victory on Northern soil could do what battlefield victories in Virginia alone never could: break the Northern will to keep fighting. Two armies stumbled into each other on a Wednesday morning in July, and the question of whether Lee was right got answered in 3 days. Before Lee crossed into Pennsylvania, the Confederacy was already losing ground, just not in Virginia. In the West, Ulysses Grant was squeezing Vicksburg, the last major Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. When Vicksburg fell, the Union would cut the Confederacy in two. The Southern war effort was bleeding in the West, and there wasn't much Lee could do about it from Virginia. What he could do was take the fight north. Lee's thinking was strategic and political. A Confederate army marching through Pennsylvania would threaten cities like Baltimore, Philadelphia, even Washington. That kind of pressure, combined with the casualty lists that Northern newspapers were printing every week, might finally tip Northern public opinion toward demanding a negotiated peace. There was also a diplomatic angle. Britain and France had not recognized the Confederacy as a legitimate nation. A decisive Confederate victory on Union soil might change that calculation. Foreign recognition meant foreign support, supply, ships, possibly intervention. So Lee pitched the invasion to Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy. Take the war to them, win on their ground, change the terms. Davis approved it. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, roughly 75,000 men organized into 3 corps under James Longstreet, A.P. Hill, and Richard Ewell, moved north through the Shenandoah Valley and into Maryland, then Pennsylvania. The residents of Chambersburg, Carlisle, and New York watched Confederate soldiers march through their towns. Some were terrified, some were stunned, a few were defiant. But Lee was moving blind. His cavalry commander, J.E.B. Stuart, was supposed to screen the Army's flank and feed him intelligence about Union movements. Instead, Stuart took his horsemen on a wide ride around the entire Union Army, chasing glory when Lee needed information, and fell out of contact for days. Lee didn't know where Meade's army was. He didn't know how fast it was moving. He was operating on guesswork at the worst possible time. The army on the Potomac, under a newly appointed commander named George Gordon Meade, moved north to intercept him. Meade had only been in command for 3 days when the battle started. He hadn't wanted the job when he was woken before dawn on June 28 and told he was now in command of the largest army in the country. His first response was essentially, "You've got the wrong man." His bosses disagreed. Meade was steady, professional, hard to rattle. That was exactly what they needed. Neither army was looking for Gettysburg specifically. Confederate scouts had been sent to find shoes. The town reportedly had a warehouse full of them, and Lee's men were badly in need. What they found instead was Union cavalry. And that started everything. July 1st, 1863, morning. Confederate infantry from A.P. Hill's corps moved toward Gettysburg along the Chambersburg Pike, coming in from the west. They ran into Union cavalry under John Buford about a mile outside of town. Buford knew what he was looking at. This wasn't a skirmish. This was the opening of something much larger. He sent word back to the nearest Union infantry under General John Reynolds and bought time by holding the ridgeline west of town with dismounted cavalry. They fought on foot, using their rifles like infantry, buying Reynolds the hour he needed to arrive. Reynolds arrived and recognized immediately that the ground mattered. Gettysburg sat at the intersection of 10 roads. Whoever controlled it controlled movement through the entire region. He threw his infantry into the fight and sent word back to Meade. He would hold his ground as long as he could. Reynolds didn't live to see how the day ended. He was killed by a rifle shot early in the fighting. The man who first recognized what Gettysburg was worth, who threw his infantry in and sent word he would hold, was gone within the first hours. The fighting on July 1st was brutal, and for the Union ultimately losing. Confederate forces kept arriving in greater numbers. Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps came down from the north, threatening to envelop the Union position entirely. By mid-afternoon, the Union line was cracking. Soldiers fell back through the town itself, fighting through streets and alleyways, trying to stay organized while the whole thing came apart around them. But they didn't scatter. They fell back south of town toward a ridge, and at the northern end of that ridge, a hill with a cemetery on top. They climbed it. By evening, battered and bloodied, they were holding the high ground. Lee had won the day. He had pushed the Union Army back, inflicted heavy casualties, and taken the town. What he hadn't done, and what would haunt the rest of the battle, was take that hill. Late afternoon, July 1st. The Union Army is retreating through town, and right behind them, Cemetery Hill, high ground, barely defended, the kind of position that decides battles. Lee saw it. The question was whether to take it. Lee sent orders to Richard Ewell, commander of his 2nd Corps, to take Cemetery Hill, if practicable. Those two words have been debated by historians ever since. Ewell was a capable officer, but he was new to Corps command. His predecessor, Stonewall Jackson, had been killed at Chancellorsville just weeks earlier. Jackson would almost certainly have attacked without being told twice. Ewell hesitated. His men were tired. The situation was unclear. He wasn't sure if the hill was as weakly defended as it looked. He decided it wasn't practicable after all. By morning, it absolutely was not. Meade moved the bulk of his army up overnight. Union engineers and infantry worked through the night, turning Cemetery Hill and the ridgeline running south of it into a fortified defensive line. Would have been an opportunity locked shut while Ewell paused. It's worth saying it directly. We don't know that an attack would have succeeded. The Union had artillery and rallied infantry. The terrain was difficult. Confederate soldiers had been fighting since morning. Ewell may have been right, but we know what happened because he didn't try. We don't know what would have happened if he did. By the morning of July 2nd, Meade had assembled most of his army along one of the strongest natural defensive positions of the entire war. The line ran in a fishhook shape. The barb of the hook was Culp's Hill on the right, hooking around to Cemetery Hill, and then south along Cemetery Ridge, a long, low ridge running through 2 miles, all the way to 2 rocky hills at the southern end called Big Round Top and Little Round Top. The position was nearly ideal. Union forces held the high ground, so Confederate attackers would be climbing uphill the entire way. Meade's lines were compact and inferior, meaning he could shift troops from one end to the other faster than Lee could move around the outside. And the terrain itself did half the work. Rocky outcroppings, stone walls, boulders, and steep slopes that broke up attacking formations before they even reached the Union line. Lee was outnumbered. Meade had roughly 93,000 men, and not all of them had arrived yet. Lee's army was deep in enemy territory, with long supply lines, and he still chose to attack. He had beaten this army before in worse conditions. His men believed they could win anything, and if he retreated without a decisive engagement, the entire invasion had been for nothing. He was going to find out Meade's ground on Meade's terms with fewer men. Lee's plan for July 2nd was to hit both ends of the Union line at once. Ewell would press the Union right at Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill, keeping those troops occupied. The main effort would come from the Confederate right, where James Longstreet's 1st Corps would sweep up and stripe the Union left flank before rolling up the entire line. Longstreet did not like it. Longstreet was Lee's most experienced and arguably most capable Corps commander. He favored a different approach: swing the Confederate Army around the Union left and get between Meade and Washington. Force Meade to attack on Confederate terms. It was a sound argument, and Longstreet made it more than once. Lee rejected it. He was going to attack. Longstreet's assault was supposed to go in early. It did not. The march to the attack position was delayed by scouting problems, route changes, and the need to stay hidden from Union signal station on the high ground. By the time Longstreet's men were in position and ready to move, it was mid-afternoon. Those hours mattered enormously. At the far left of the end of the Union line, the ground ended at 2 hills. The larger one, Big Round Top, was heavily wooded and difficult to move artillery onto. The smaller one, Little Round Top, was critical. It sat at the end of the Union line and overlooked the entire left flank. Confederate artillery on Little Round Top could fire along the length of the entire Union position. It was the key to everything. On the afternoon of July 2nd, Little Round Top was almost completely undefended. A Union engineer officer named Governor Warren climbed the hill, looked out, and understood immediately what was about to happen. He sent riders in every direction looking for troops, any troops. What arrived at almost the last possible moment was a regiment of Maine infantry under a colonel named Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Confederate forces hit the Union line on Little Round Top repeatedly. The 20th Maine was at the far end of the Union left, the absolute end of the line. If they broke or were flanked, the entire Union Army was in danger. They ran out of ammunition. They were exhausted. Men were down everywhere. Chamberlain was out of options. He ordered a bayonet charge downhill. It was one of the most desperate decisions of the battle. It worked. The Confederate assault collapsed, prisoners were taken, and Little Round Top held. It's worth being careful about scale here. The 20th Maine was one regiment in one engagement on one part of the field, and Chamberlain himself consistently created the collective effort. Other units, including the 104th New York, were also fighting and dying on those slopes. The Battle of Gettysburg was not decided by a single bayonet charge, but Little Round Top was a genuine turning point in the afternoon, fighting on July 2nd. And if it had fallen, the consequences could have been severe. While Chamberlain's men were fighting for their lives on Little Round Top, the rest of the Union line was coming apart. The problem started with Union General Daniel Sickles. Sickles commanded the 3rd Corps, which was supposed to hold Cemetery Ridge, the main Union defensive line. But Sickles didn't like his assigned position. The ridge was slightly lower than the ground to the west, and Sickles decided on his own authority to advance his entire corps forward for about half a mile to higher ground. He created a salient, a position that bulged outward and could be attacked from 3 sides. Anchored on a peach orchard, he didn't tell Meade he was doing this. When Meade found out, he was furious. Confederate forces hit Sickles' advanced position hard. The fighting in the peach orchard and the adjacent wheat field was some of the bloodiest of the entire 3 days. Units were destroyed, ground changed hands multiple times. Men who survived described it as a roaring confusion of smoke, noise, and the dead. Sickles himself lost his leg to a cannonball during the fighting. He was carried off the field smoking a cigar, allegedly to show his men he was still alive and composed. He later had the leg preserved and donated it to the Army Medical Museum in Washington, where he reportedly visited it on anniversaries of the battle. By evening, Confederate attacks had pushed the Union forces back. At one point during the July 2nd fighting, a Confederate breakthrough looked imminent. Meade ordered the 1st Minnesota to charge directly into it. 262 men against a Confederate force 4 times their size. They stopped the breakthrough. They lost 82% of their men in 8 minutes. The line held. On the Union right, fighting at Culp's Hill raged into the night and resumed the following morning. Confederate forces under Ewell managed to occupy some of the Union fortifications on the lower slopes during the evening of July 2nd. Largely because many of the troops defending that ground had been pulled south to reinforce other parts of the line. When those troops returned, they found Confederates in their own trenches and had to fight to take them back. The fighting on the morning of July 3rd was intense and, for the Confederates, ultimately unsuccessful. Union forces cleared the hill and secured the right flank before noon. Ewell's corps had spent the entire battle in costly, inconclusive combat, neither breaking the Union right nor pulling significant forces away from the crisis points elsewhere. By the time the guns fell silent on Culp's Hill, Lee had already made his decision. By the morning of July 3rd, Lee had tried both flanks. Both had failed. Lee believed the Union center was weak. His army had been hammering the flanks for 2 days, and Meade must have stripped the center to reinforce them. If a massive concentrated assault could break through Cemetery Ridge at its center, it could split the Union Army in two. Longstreet argued against it. He told Lee directly that no 15,000 men who ever lived could take that position. Lee told him to proceed. The assault would be held by George Pickett's Fresh Division of Virginians, reinforced by 2 more divisions on either side. Command fell to Longstreet, who, by his own account, could barely bring himself to give the order. The Confederates opened with a massive artillery bombardment, roughly 140 to 170 guns firing along a wide front, intended to soften the Union center before the infantry advanced. Union artillery responded. For nearly 2 hours, the largest artillery exchange ever seen on American soil shook the ground for miles around. Civilians 30 miles away reported hearing it. What the Confederate gunners did not know and couldn't see through the smoke was that many of their shells were overshooting the Union infantry on Cemetery Ridge and landing behind the crest. The Union infantry hugged the ground and took casualties, but not nearly as many as the Confederates hoped. When the Union artillery deliberately slowed its fire, a calculated move to deceive the Confederates into thinking they destroyed the batteries, Confederate commanders read it as evidence that the Union guns were knocked out. They were not. At roughly 3 p.m., approximately 12,500 Confederate soldiers stepped out of the tree line on Seminary Ridge and began walking across almost a mile of open, largely flat ground toward the Union center. Union artillery, its batteries very much intact, opened up. First with solid shot at long range, then with shell, then with canister. Canisters packed with iron balls that turned artillery pieces into enormous shotgun at close range. Confederate formations that had been parade ground perfect began to come apart. Men fell by the dozens, then by the hundred. They kept walking. Union infantry along Cemetery Ridge waited behind a low stone wall. When the Confederates got close enough, the infantry opened fire. Whole sections of the advancing line simply ceased to exist. Flanking fire from both left and right added to the slaughter. And yet, a small number of Confederate soldiers made it through. At a section of the line called the Angle, where the stone wall made a turn, Confederates under General Lewis Armistead broke through. Armistead crossed the wall with his hat on his sword, leading his men into the Union position. This moment, as deep as Confederate forces ever penetrated into the Union line on any day of the battle, has been called the high water mark of the Confederacy. Armistead was mortally wounded moments after crossing the wall. The men who followed him were surrounded, killed, or captured. The breakthrough lasted minutes. In less than an hour from the time Pickett's men stepped out of the tree line to the time the survivors drifted back, the charge was over. When the survivors came back, Lee rode out to meet them. He told them it was his fault. He told them they were still his men. He told them to reform. Pickett reportedly never forgave him. He lost most of his division. On July 4th, Lee's army began its retreat. That same day, Vicksburg surrendered to Grant. Meade did not pursue aggressively. His army had also been torn apart over 3 days. Roughly 23,000 Union soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. Lee's losses were around 28,000, though the exact number is disputed. Total casualties across both armies ran somewhere between 46 to 51,000. Lee had started the campaign with 75,000 men. He was retreating with something like 47,000. Lincoln was furious. He wrote a scathing letter calling it a golden opportunity wasted. He never sent it, but he believed until the end of the war that the Army of the Potomac had let Lee escape when he could have destroyed him. Meade's army, by any honest accounting, was in no condition to mount a sustained pursuit. And even in retreat, the Army of Northern Virginia was a dangerous disciplined force that would not have gone quietly. What isn't disputed is this: Lee crossed back into Virginia. The invasion was over and he never invaded the North again. The Mississippi River was open. The Confederacy was cut in half. Gettysburg and Vicksburg fell into the same week. One closed the door on Confederate victory in the East, the other split the Confederacy in two. The war would grind on for nearly 2 more years, but the strategic question was effectively settled. But why did Lee lose? Day one set the table. Ewell's hesitation handed Meade the high ground and the night to fortify it. The attacks on July 2nd were late, uncoordinated, and made against a position that had been strengthening all morning. Longstreet's assault went in piecemeal rather than as a unified blow. Coordination between Longstreet on the right and Ewell on the left was poor. Lee was also working blind the entire time. Stuart's cavalry was supposed to be his eyes. Instead, Stuart was riding glory laps around the Union Army, while Lee made decisions without knowing where Meade's forces were or how fast they were coming. Bad intelligence almost guarantees bad decisions. And then there is Pickett's charge, a frontal assault against a fortified position held by a larger army with superior artillery. Military historians have spent 160 years trying to understand what Lee was thinking. The most honest answer may be that he trusted his army too much. He had seen them do the impossible before. He thought they could do it again. Well, they couldn't. Gettysburg ended something specific, the possibility of a Confederate victory in the East that could break the North's will to keep fighting. After Gettysburg, the Confederacy was fighting to survive. The Union was fighting to finish. In November 1863, Abraham Lincoln came to Gettysburg to dedicate a national cemetery for the soldiers who had died there. The featured speaker was Edward Everett, one of the most acclaimed orators in America. He spoke for 2 hours. Lincoln spoke for 2 minutes. He said the living could not consecrate or hallow the ground, that the men who fought and died there had already done that beyond any words or ceremony. He said the nation was engaged in a test of whether a government founded on equality and democratic principle could survive. And he said the task of the living was to ensure that the dead had not died in vain. The address he gave that day is 272 words long. It may be the finest short speech in American history. The war itself ground on for nearly 2 more years. Ulysses Grant took command of all Union armies in 1864 and did what no Union commander had done before. He kept attacking, kept pressing, refused to let Lee recover. The Army of Northern Virginia was slowly bled dry. On April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The war was over. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, abolished slavery in the United States. The economic order the Confederacy had gone to war to protect was dismantled in law. 4 million people were free. What followed was messier: Reconstruction, the attempt to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved people into American civic life, was underfunded, undermined, and eventually abandoned. The promise Lincoln articulated at Gettysburg, that this nation was dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, took another century to begin to be enforced in law, and in practice remained unfinished. The men who died at Gettysburg did not die for a country that immediately became what Lincoln said it should be, but they died at the turning point that made it possible. Gettysburg was fought less than 50 years after Waterloo. Same century, same basic armies, infantry, cavalry, artillery, but the weapons had changed and the tactics hadn't caught up. That gap killed tens of thousands of men in 3 days. The single biggest difference was the rifle. At Waterloo, most infantry carried smoothbore muskets, accurate to maybe 50 yards, and in practical terms, that meant two armies had to get very close before the shooting became truly deadly, which is why Napoleonic commanders could still mass their infantry in dense formations and march them forward toward the enemy. The musket couldn't reach them until they were nearly on top of each other. By 1863, both sides at Gettysburg were largely equipped with rifled muskets. The grooved barrel spun the bullet, stabilizing it in flight. Effective range jumped to 300, 400, even 500 yards. A soldier behind a stone wall on Cemetery Ridge could hit a man walking across an open field almost half a mile away. Pickett's charge was a Napoleonic tactic executed against rifle-armed infantry. Lee had watched these tactics work before at Chancellorsville, at Second Bull Run. But those battles had different terrain, different conditions. Here, 12,000 men walked across nearly a mile of open ground in two weapons that could kill them from the moment they stepped out of the tree line. The rifle didn't just make the charge costly, it made it a different problem entirely than anything Napoleon ever faced. As for machine guns, they were coming. The Gatling gun was patented in 1862, the year before Gettysburg. It existed, but it wasn't on that field and barely appeared anywhere during the Civil War. The rotating machine gun that would define the carnage of the next major wars, the Franco-Prussian Wars, the Boer War, and eventually the First World War, was still a prototype sitting in a workshop while men at Gettysburg fought with rifles and smoothbores and bayonets. The rifle made defense dominant. Any army holding good ground with rifled muskets and artillery could exact a punishing toll on anyone attacking across open terrain. Lee knew this. He had used that equation in his favor for 2 years in Virginia. Gettysburg was not inevitable. A few decisions made differently could have changed everything. If Ewell had taken Cemetery Hill on the evening of July 1st, the Union Army would have lost the high ground before most of its forces even arrived. The entire battle could have flipped. If Longstreet had launched his attack at dawn on July 2nd instead of late afternoon, he might have seized Little Round Top, undefended, and rolled up the Union left flank before Meade could reinforce it. But the biggest what-if is Pickett's charge. If those 12,500 Confederates had broken through the Union center, if they had held the angle and split Meade's army in two, everything changes. Northern morale could have been shattered. The peace movement in the North would have exploded. Lincoln would have faced crushing political pressure ahead of the 1864 election. A negotiated peace, and with it Confederate independence, could have suddenly looked possible. That's what the Confederacy truly needed. Not more territory, a way out. One charge, one breakthrough, and a completely different ending to the war. In closing, these men did not fight at a crossroads. They fought over a question, whether a country built on the idea of equality could survive when half of it went to war to preserve slavery. Whether the economic order that held 4 million people in bondage could be ended by force when it refused to end by argument. Gettysburg did not answer that question. It kept it alive long enough to be answered. They fought over whether this nation could long endure. For 3 days in July 1863, the answer hung in the balance of a few hills in Pennsylvania. And that's what the ground it's worth. Next time, it's 1914. The German army is 6 weeks from Paris, and the French are out of options. The First Battle of the Marne. I will see you on the next battlefield. Bye.